is being recorded.
The meeting is being recorded. So thank you for coming along to this seminar today. This is another seminar in the series organised by the Institute for Northern Studies at the University of Highlands and Islands. And today we are delighted to have our guest speaker, Dr. Michèle Hayeur Smith, who is a research associate with the Havenraffer Museum, which is part of Brown University. And today, Michèle is going to be telling us about her fantastic book, The Valkyries of Loom, the archaeology of cloth production and female power in the North Atlantic. This book came out in November last year. And, you'll hear all about it. But, if you haven't read it, I really do recommend it. It's a fantastic book. It's incredibly well written, is easy to read, and it's so interdisciplinary, taking in the sciences, written sources, archaeological material, and it also covers a really long time period as well. So it provides a fabulous insight into, all the ins and outs of textile production in the North Atlantic. So without further ado, I'll give the word to you, Michèle, and see if you can share your screen with us. Yeah, that seems to be coming along.
There we go. Now you can hear me.
We can.
That works? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Alex. I think I'll start out by thanking, well, not only you, Alex, for inviting me to do this, but also everyone at the Institute of Northern Studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands. So it's really my pleasure to come and talk to you today about this book that was published in the middle of the pandemic in November by University Press Florida, which is basically a culmination of research that has been going on for about 10 years. And I thought I'd start out by talking to you a little bit about basically the book, the parameters of the book, et cetera, and how this whole thing came to be, basically. And I wanted to start out by saying that I am an archaeologist, and I know that frequently in archaeology, people who work on textiles are either textile archaeologists or textile specialists. And I wanted to say that I think I differ a little bit in that regard, and I want to sort of distinguish myself in that regard, in that I am not a textile archaeologist. I am an archaeologist who happens to be working with textiles. And it's one, I feel that my approach and the way I work with the material could be applied to basically any form of material culture. So the way this all happened is that we were actually it all started in 2009 on an excavation that my husband was actually running in Western Iceland at the site of Gilsbakki. And we were doing some surveying, and we ended up in one of the middens, and we came across quite a few textiles, which, as you all know, is sort of a rarity in archaeology, because frequently, these sorts of organic remains do not preserve. And I thought I had been really interested before. In fact, I had done my PhD at the University of Glasgow on jewelry, and I was really interested in issues of dress and adornment and what this all meant in terms of cultural identity or projection of identity and various components of society. So I'm really interested in dress, basically, as from that perspective, and textiles as well. So what can the textiles actually tell us about society, rather than what are the techniques used in the textiles? So that's sort of kind of my approach. Anyway, back to Gilsbakki. So we had this substantial collection of about 200 pieces of cloth, and I decided that I would tackle this. I had grown up with a mother who was an anthropologist. We have a lot of ethnographic textiles around the house from all over the world, so it wasn't completely foreign to me. And so I started looking at this material, and what I did was actually I wrote a small grant to the National Science Foundation. It's the department, or it's actually Arctic Social Sciences Department of Polar Programs, to do sort of an assessment of what the collections really looked like in Iceland, because I wondered, in fact, if there were more huge textile collections in the museum that had been excavated in the past. And when I got there, there were actually hundreds and thousands even of archaeological textiles, which was really quite remarkable. So that prompted me, and I'm just going to try and change slide here. Here we go. Prompted me to write another project. So you see the first one up here called Rags to Riches, which was really focusing on the material from Iceland and going through these extensive collections. That sort of gave me a whole sort of feeling for the material. And then after that, I thought, well, I'm going to write a second grant. These are all still through the National Science Foundation. And I wrote in 2013, I was awarded another grant to look at the material around the North Atlantic in relationship to Iceland, to see exactly what Iceland's role, or how these other regions of Norse settlement resembled or differed from what I had seen in Iceland. And I wrote then another one in 2018. And this is the one I'm working on right now, Archaeological Investigations of the Eastern North Atlantic Trade and Globalizing Economic Systems, looking at the trade in North Atlantic textiles towards Europe at various times. Also something that we don't know a lot about. So just so that everybody who is not familiar with the North Atlantic, this is basically the region we're talking about. Actually, we should extend this now into Norway, because I'm also working a lot with Norwegian material. But this is basically my starting point. So it includes obviously Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Scotland as well. So one of the things that I was really interested in when I started this project in 2009, 2010, I was really also interested in looking at women in the past. And I found that when I got into the North Atlantic, I found that a lot of the archaeology was really focused on the archaeology of men, on the archaeology of male institutions and things that men did, and didn't really take into account the other half of the population. When it came to textiles, textiles are also an area that tend to be somewhat neglected in that region, definitely. There was one historian who had done actually a PhD on the textiles, particularly in Iceland, from, in fact, what they call vaðmál, which was cloth currency used in Iceland. His name was Helgi Thorleikson. He did his PhD on vaðmál in 1991. But again, he was using historic sources which were written by men, and he is a man. So it's, again, from a male perspective. So I thought, okay, what about looking at the archaeological data and trying getting a sense of what the women, what their contributions were to this whole process? And I think that I found that in the museum, there were these vast collections in the thousands that had really not been dealt with or worked with. I would say that these are not beautiful textiles. These are really scrappy little brown rags. In fact, I like to call them my dirty brown rags. And I thought, in a sense, what better way than to look at this material if you want to look at women, because it also came to my attention that in the Norse societies, women was very much of textiles were very much of and textile production very much of a gendered activity, and something that men did not engage in. So if you wanted to find women, what better way than to find the things that women actually made? And I think part of the reasons why they hadn't really been dealt with in Iceland is in part because I think a lot of people get sort of turned off by the sort of ultra specialized nature of textile analysis. There had been actually one, I guess I wouldn't say she was an archaeologist, but she was anyway a textile person called Elsa Guðjónsson, who has since passed away, who spent and dedicated her entire career to looking at textiles in Iceland. But she was mostly interested in embroidery and medieval things or fineries or church fineries. And she did some work on the archaeological material, for example, certain types of weaves like pile weaving or tablet weaving. But she didn't tackle sort of in a comprehensive way these huge collections. So it's they were sort of a little bit like nails. Like, what do we do with all these little pieces of cloth? Like, what do we do with all these nails? So I looked at this and I thought, okay, well, this is a great opportunity to get at the story of women and what women were doing by looking at the products and the things they made, particularly as it seemed, that it had been used as currency, which is a fairly important thing and ties into the economy and so on. So basically, and I wanted to say actually a bit more about this in terms of expression. I also see that textiles were actually a form of expression for women. And There is actually an etymological connection between the word textile, text, and the Latin verb texto, which means to weave. So in a society that was also somewhat patriarchal, there was a huge emphasis, as we know, on the spoken word and male verbal expression and performance, or the ability to be skilled in poetry and skaldic poetry, mythology, etc., was highly valued. So you could think that maybe, in fact, women's form of expression was through weaving. So in a way, men spoke, and in the meantime, women wove. So you could say, well, how do they express themselves through textiles? Well, the most obvious thing could be, if you think about embroideries, for example, what better way to express your views on your family, on your kin group? If you think of embroideries or tapestries, for example, these huge tapestries that sort of adorned the inside of longhouses, where women actually had control on what dialogue or what stories they were telling through these tapestries. So how does that work with the dirty brown rags? And this was sort of, there were actually a lot of stories that came out of this whole thing. And at some level, if you think about these small rags and they're trying to determine, for example, how to make this cloth more resilient in the face of climate change or other issues, or even in the question of making money or using textiles as money, then women definitely had a say in this. And this is a form of female expression as well. And I think so that's sort of been the approach that I've taken. And I'm just going to put a little quote up here by Janet Berlow, who summarizes really well, I think, how I see textiles and how textiles and the sorts of information that they encode. So as a mode of self-presentation, textiles assert personal, ethnic, religious, and economic identities. Textiles are also eloquent historical texts encoding change, appropriation, oppression, and endurance, as well as personal and cultural aesthetic visions. So, like I said, so for me, it rapidly became clear that, I work very much, as many North Americans do, from an anthropological perspective, anthropological archaeologist, but they really do reflect a lot of big events and express big events. They express ideas of social change, of climate change, like I said, conversion to Christianity. And so all of these things, so these are the sorts of things that I was really interested in sort of getting at. And in so doing, the way I did this was actually through a very much of, as Alex pointed out, a very interdisciplinary approach, using archaeology, archaeological science. I did strontium isotope analysis on the textiles, DNA analysis, AMS dating quite extensively, but I also used the written sources, I used the law books, and I also used some of the saga sources. And I know for some people, there's a big sort of separation between mixing these types of data together, but I feel that in a sense, in an area where we don't necessarily have a lot of information available to us, I think we have to use and we have to mine all of these various sources of data. And for me, at some level, the sagas, no, you don't take them at face value. You don't take them for an indication of how events happened necessarily. But from an anthropological perspective, these are ethnographies. And these are documents that hold information that can be used and can reflect cultural values. And you'll find that in many cultures, even though these texts have been written 200 years later, cultural attitudes tend to change really much more slowly. And in a sense, they may have been expressing attitudes that happened in the Viking Age, but if you think about it, even though you may have changed religion, your attitudes, your cultural attitudes may continue to prevail like this. And this is like common across all human cultures. So I don't see them as not useful texts and sources to use. So another thing I wanted to just talk about briefly was also the time frame of the book, which I know some might think that this is a huge time frame. It basically started in the Viking Age at the beginning of the settlement of the North Atlantic Islands, and I decided to stop it basically in the 1800s, so in the 19th century. And the reason for this huge time span was because it allows you, one of the things with textiles and dress as well in non-industrial contexts is that things tend to change very, very slowly. So they tend, it's not like today, we're really the byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, where things, you know, we have fashion and clothing and textiles that change sort of monthly. You know, this is just the way, it's the whole concept of fast fashion. In the past, things changed very, very slowly. And so, in fact, by using a large time frame like this, it allows you to kind of monitor the changes. And generally, when something happens and changes in the material culture or in the textiles themselves, it's because something external is impacting the society and making things change in that way. It could be environmental, it can be a change in religion, it can be all sorts of things. So for me, that was a sort of a really important, you know, kind of sort of, it gives you a sort of a big long-term perspective of the thing, of the phenomena. The way I organize the chapter, and I'll go through this really quickly because you can also just go and read the book, but the first chapter was actually looking at the mythological associations of weaving textiles in the mythical world, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I focused on Viking Age Iceland. So I had to work, obviously, I let the data kind of drive me where there was information, where the sources were, where the material was. There's a lot of data from Scotland and from Ireland. So this was a great place to deal with the Viking Age. There's almost nothing from the Faroe Islands, and obviously there's nothing from Greenland. Chapter 3, I looked at the cloth currency, the issues in Iceland, and verify also, was this happening in other parts of the North Atlantic? Chapters 4 and 5 dealt with Greenland in the medieval period, the use of textiles and climate change, the use of admixtures of furs to textiles, the issue of recycling of textiles, which is a huge issue in the North Atlantic. In chapter 6, I dealt with trade, mostly sort of medieval to late medieval trade with Europe into Iceland based on some strontium isotope work that we had done. And in chapter 7, I end up in the 17th century with the Danish trade monopoly and the impact of Danish colonialism on these North Atlantic islands with regards to textile production. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit now about basically what I covered somewhat in chapter 1, and also was sort of the basis for the title of the book, The Valkyries Loom. Why did I call it The Valkyries Loom? And for me, as I sort of began to research this, first of all, it was very clear that textile production was very much of a gendered activity that was carried out by women, and men did not engage in it. There even seems to be taboos about men engaging in textile production, and I'll get into that in a second. And I found that actually the acts of textile production were also surrounded with concepts of fear of women at some level, or fear of the process, of power, of sort of empowering women, of respect of women. But they were also in turn sort of reflections of otherworldly pursuits. So textiles seem to be tied in also with the mythical realm, and particularly some of the powerful goddesses and Decead and spirits and so on, but I'm thinking in part of the goddess Freya. So I just wanted to read a little passage actually from the first chapter, or I think it's the introduction chapter, which kind of talks a bit about these associations, and I'll give you more examples of this as well. So this one comes from Jomsviking's saga. It says that she soon fell asleep and she had a dream, which she related to Palnir on awakening. I dreamt, she said, that I was staying here on this estate, and I thought that I had a gray-colored cloth in the loom. It seems as though the weights were attached to the cloth, and I was weaving. When one of the weights fell down behind from the middle of the cloth, I noticed that the weights were the heads of men. I took up that head and recognized it. When Palnir asked whose head it was, she said it was of King Harald Gormson. So that is just, like I said, just one example from the sagas, and there's many, many more. But to me, what was becoming increasingly clear is the more I researched this, and I'm not the only one to have worked on this, actually, Karen Beck-Peterson wrote extensively about these issues and these associations of weaving and textile work with the mythical realm. But there definitely seemed to be associations between women, textile production, birth, death, and fate, and the control of fate. And again, this is not uncommon or it's not unknown in other cultural contexts. We have, for example, the most obvious example of the three Norns under the world tree, who are, according to some, weaving the fates of men. We often have deities that are dealing with fate that are female deities. there seem to also be associations between the act of spinning and the practice of seidr, which was a form of female magic, and other analogies alluding to the fact that cloth was almost like the creation of part of your essence or your person. And the example that comes to mind is the one from Njal's saga, where Hildegund throws a cloak over, I think it's her uncle Flossi, and it's the cloak of her husband who's been killed, and the cloak is full of blood and it drips on him, or dried up blood. So that image is sort of, you know, really quite powerful. And she does this, in fact, to goad him, to seek revenge. But if you think about it, that it would almost seem, you know, that textiles are more than just textiles. And it makes me think of something that Terence Turner wrote about the social skin, where in fact you have your biological body underneath, and in fact the clothing is a type of social body that you add on, where all, in fact, the cultural associations are placed. So it's a second skin in that regard. And they carry all sorts of messages about who you are in society, your social position, what gender you are, your social status, etc. And again, to me, this is sort of like there's deep connections again from there to actually the making of a person, so to birth and death and the control of death, or the control of fate. And probably the most striking poem of all, which I will also read to you, comes from Njal's saga, from the Darðarljóð, and this is a poem that describes an event that happened before the Battle of Clontarf in Ireland, and a farmer by the name of Dorúð, who some people have ascribed to Odin, but I haven't found anything convincing about that, but it's possible, was basically standing and saw coming from the sky 12 Valkyries riding horses, and they come down from the sky. They go into the weaving huts, and this I talk about in the book, called the Dinja, which are also gendered spaces for women, where women carried out textile production, also completely taboo for men to go into these. He looks inside the window and he sees these Valkyries, and this is the image that you have on the screen here, weaving basically a textile made with the entrails of men, and the loom weights are their heads. And interestingly, battle is obviously integrated in this, with the various components of the loom being weapons and spears, arrows, swords, etc. So it goes, blood rains from the cloudy web on the broad loom of slaughter. The web of man, grey as armor, is now being woven. The Valkyries will cross it with a crimson weft. The warp is made of human entrails, and human heads are used as weights. The heddle rods are blood-wet spears. The shafts are iron-bound. The arrows are shuttles. With swords, we will weave this web of battle. So what they do is, once they've finished weaving, they take the cloth down, they cut it into 12 pieces. Each Valkyrie takes one, they leave the Dinja, and they fly off. And of course, the battle is a total disaster, and there's many people are killed. So it's almost like a prophecy, a little bit, a prophecy of what's to come, or basically the controlling of this sort of event. So again, this connection between fate and also textile work. Coming back to seidr too, seidr, there seems to be associations with, like I said, with spinning. I also think about some of these burials that were found containing women who were potentially these seeresses, the vulva, often found with staves, which were thought to be part of their equipment for the practice of this form of magic, the seidr stuff. And when you look at them carefully, they're actually all distaffs. The fact that some of them have got baskets on the end are actually distaffs. But the interesting thing is that they are iron, and not wood, which is what you would normally use as opposed to iron. So they're kind of symbolically associated with that. So there's definitely this weird, interesting connection, which I think made textile production even more of an exclusively female and gendered activity. When you see in medieval Iceland that textiles become part of the currency, part of the economy, the men still do not engage in textile production ever. Until the Danish trade monopoly. So it really does remain a sort of a female activity, and one that has associations. If men are involved in this, or involved in seidr, or involved in spinning, again, seems to be that these two are often considered equal, that they could be accused of having too much ergi, or too much potentially being effeminate, not being masculine enough, and potentially being homosexual. So there's, like I said, even though I feel that even though these beliefs may have been present in the Viking Age, by the time you get into the medieval period and they're no longer, they're now Christian, these beliefs may not have disappeared. They may not remember why they have these attitudes, but the cultural attitudes of like, well, men just don't engage in that sort of thing. Why? Maybe we don't remember why, but that's not the point. The point is now this is part of your cultural attitude. So I felt that this was sort of an underlying element in all of the work that I was doing in the North Atlantics, which is why I actually gave the name for the book, The Valkyries of Loom. So I wanted to talk to you also a little bit more about the actual corpus itself and the kind of stories that have come out of this. Like I said, I talked to you about really the type of material I found in Iceland was incredible. There was a huge amount of textiles. Conservatively, I would say 8,000 to 10,000 plus textiles, and there's probably actually more than that. I've looked at 36 different sites from these various periods from Iceland. In Greenland, there's between 736 to 1,000 plus. I always put plus because every time there's new excavations coming, there's more added to the collection. There was actually a very good book done on the Greenlandic material that I used extensively, written by Elsa Østergaard in 2004, where she really did a thorough overview of this collection, though that was kind of my Bible. And what I did is I added on to the things that she had not seen because they came from more recent excavations. The Faroe Islands had a very small collection, almost like actually no Viking material, maybe one or two pieces from the Viking Age, not a very big collection, sort of an interesting collection with a lot of actually the actual textiles missing and mostly remains of textile making debris, which sort of raises some interesting questions about trade. Scotland I looked at mostly the Viking Age material. I mean, I went back and looked at some of the medieval material, but the problem is, oops, I think my slide just jumped. Part of the problem with Scotland is that, you know, in the other parts of the North Atlantic, you're dealing with areas where there were, in essence, no local populations that were interacting directly with the Norse. Like Iceland, there was no one. In Greenland, there were the Inuit, but at the time they arrived, they were not anywhere near them, and they came down at a later period. In the Faroe Islands, there was nobody. But in Scotland, there was a lot of people. So it's kind of difficult afterwards to determine, well, what's going on in the medieval period, in the Viking or the Norse settlements, because people, I think, just integrated into society. So I worked mostly on the material of those two areas, basically Scotland and Iceland. Some of the stories that I've been able to tell, well, actually, I keep mentioning Greenland and the issues of the climate change, and I think this is a great story to sort of understand the impact that or that women can have in society that might not be so obvious in your face, but more kind of discreet, more hidden, more behind the scenes. But, you know, there's been a lot of work done in zooarchaeology, looking at land management or the management of animals and livestock and farming practices, particularly in light of the Little Ice Age, which starts to happen around the 1300s in the North Atlantic and really had a very strong impact in Greenland, a very strong impact in Iceland as well, slightly later. And so in Greenland, what you see is that obviously these are people that come from Iceland, so they bring with them the textiles traditions from Iceland. So the early material in the Greenland colony are very much like the Icelandic material. And here's an example right here of this stuff. And this is from the same site in the Eastern Settlement, the site of E172, which was excavated by Konrad Smirovsky from Hunter College. And what you can see is the tools that they used in the North Atlantic they use the same tools, in fact, for almost 800 years, which is basically the warp-weighted loom with the drop spindle or the high top whirl. So there's no spinning wheels, there's no flat looms. This is something that comes in the 17th century or 18th century, so quite late. So they're using really a very sort of basic loom. And one thing to understand also in Iceland and in these regions is that there's no specialized industry. We have no urban centers here. So we're not talking about a textile tradition that is based in an industrial type of thing of what you're already seeing in Europe, organized in guilds, organized in a much more sort of sophisticated way. We're talking about people making textiles on individual farms, women making this stuff, on almost every single farm. And when it becomes currency, this is happening on every farm across Iceland. So in coming back to the Greenland situation, the textiles they bring with them are very much anchored in this tradition. And on the warp weighted loom, the warp yarns, which are the vertical ones, the horizontal ones are called the weft yarns, they tend to outnumber the weft yarns. So on the old loom, the warp ones, the vertical yarns tend to outnumber the weft. That's pretty much a kind of a given, a standard which you find in the textiles. But in Greenland, and it's not me who actually identified this, it was Elsa Østergaard, noted that in the later period, the textiles were not warp dominant with more warps than wefts, but actually the other way around, weft dominant. And she was trying to understand why this would be the case. So the one on the right here, this one is weft dominant. These are the weft yarns, and you can see how tightly packed they are, which is a little bit different from this one right here. Her conclusion was this had to do with cooling climates, and they were trying to make cloth that was warmer. So they were beating in more yarn and making it really tight and compact. So what I decided to do was to take that idea. She called this actually, this material here, the Greenlandic vadmal. What I found is actually, it starts out that in the beginning of the colony, you do actually have both kinds of cloth, but this type of cloth outnumbers this one. And then as you see the climate beginning to get colder, you actually see more of this. You still continue to see the occasional pieces of this, but this becomes the dominant textile. So it definitely is. So what I decided to do was to date it and see exactly when this was occurring. And I ended up with a date that was roughly sort of late 1200s, early 1300s, and I decided to coincide this with climate data to see exactly what this would tell us and if there was a correlation with the Little Ice Age. So this is taken from the Greenland ice cores, and you can see these are the fluctuations in climate in the North Atlantic, and you can see this dip starting to happen right here where things start to get considerably cooler and going downwards from there on. And this coincides exactly with the intensification of this type of cloth. So from an archaeological perspective or a social archaeological perspective, looking at women, looking for women, okay, women may not have been directly involved in farming, but this is a female response to a similar issue, and it's one that we don't pay attention to. And this is as important, and these are decisions that women, individual women, decided to take regarding the situation that they were living, regarding the colonization of this place, of this area that had a harsh climate, and where the climate was actually potentially getting worse and worse through time. So that's like one little story. Another thing that I found looking at the Icelandic material, and so I'm jumping around here a little bit, is that also by looking at this huge time frame, I was also able to get a sense almost of a chronology of weaving that you could almost use in a sense to date archaeological sites if you didn't have absolute methods, or you didn't have radiocarbon or whatever. You could actually, if you have textiles, you can kind of determine, if you know how they're made internally and what happens. This is not a static thing, that this changed with various events. And what I found actually was that in Iceland, for example, in the beginning of the settlement, the textiles are made in a certain manner. So you have a little block right here from basically the Landnam period. And one of the things that actually does change in, or what is unique to that period, is the textiles in that period are very abundant, very diverse. And I'm talking about Iceland here. They tend to also be internally spun in a certain way. So I think I have another slide. Hang on, I'm just going to jump through this and just to give you a quick explanation of spinning. When you spin yarn, you can spin in two directions. If you spin clockwise, we say that it is Z spun. So it looks like this. When you spin in the opposite direction, counterclockwise, we say that it is S spun. So back to our slide here, and I'm going to see if I can start this over again. Here we go. So what we find in the Viking Age material from burial context is all the textiles are spun Z to Z uniformly. And sometime around 1000, you begin to get another type of cloth, which is spun Z to S. So this would be Z in the warp and S in the weft, as the Viking Age material would be Z in the warp and Z in the weft. So these are minor details. You might not think they're very important, but you'll see they actually can tell you quite a bit about things. And the question as to why they changed this way is something I'll talk about in a minute. And then we enter into the medieval period, where suddenly the textiles are not as beautiful and abundant. There's not as many diverse weaves. There's mostly two kinds of weaves that really sort of dominate the scene, and that's the tabby weave and the 2-to-2 twill. So if you all have a tweed jacket, that is basically a twill, 2 to 2 twill, meaning 2 over, 2 under. That becomes these two textiles become the dominant types in the medieval period, almost so that it is a chunk, a block. And they're made in a specific way. They are always Z in the warp, S in the weft, so differing from the Viking Age material early on. You also have the appearance of knits that show up in the 1500. Prior to that, they did have a type of knitting called nalbindung, which was a type of Viking knitting. But this is different. This is the knitting with 2 needles, the way we knit today, basically. And then you enter into 1603 is the Danish trade monopoly. So you have a complete radical change that happens in Iceland. For one, you have an increase in imports. There are so many imports in the material from this period onwards that the textiles actually become extremely complex. With local homespun production, with imported material, and also with more sophisticated material showing up at home as well. And this in itself also creates sort of its own block. And to finish off, you also have the introduction in the 1700 by the Danish authorities of the flat looms, the spinning wheel, and the industrialization of Icelandic textiles, which radically changes the position of women in textiles, and also just what is showing up in the corpus at that point is really this period, basically from 1600. There are the largest collections are in this area here. So you have really these distinct things going on archaeologically in the textiles that I said you sort of use as a almost as a guideline of assessing, okay, well, what period does this come from? Another thing I wanted to talk about are also the comparison between textiles from Iceland and from Scotland, which was an interesting comparison. And these are from Viking burials in both contexts. And you'll see that the collections in Scotland are much bigger. But they're also mostly mineralized textiles that are attached to weaponry or jewelry or various things. In fact, there's very few items that are actually pieces of cloth, and there are far more in Iceland. So that was already sort of a first kind of sort of a difference between the material. Overall, I got the sense by looking at these two collections that you may have had more elaborate types of weaves in the Scottish material than you had in the Icelandic material, probably also because Scotland is much closer to Norway and to the Scandinavian mainland than Iceland was much farther off. So just to look at, for example, the different types of these are based on thread counts. So a lot of the work that I do is actually using thread counts to figure out and then plotting them to figure out various patterns in the production of textiles. And you see that comes really in handy when you're looking at currency as well, where you see standardization in this way. So you can see that you have sort of an array of these are fairly, and I would say just pay attention to this, because when we come to the medieval period and you look at how it'll differ, it's not spread out like this. So you have some fairly high thread counts, which is quite common. This is the Icelandic material compared to the Scottish material in the background. Again, here you see less high-end textiles that you would see here, where you have quite high-end, high thread counts. So this is a little bit like if you're buying sheets today and you look at the thread count to see how fine the quality is of your sheets. This is the same sort of thing. The higher the thread count, the finer the textile, basically. So these are very finely woven textiles, and you can see that obviously Scotland has more than Iceland does. Again, another thing that comes out, and I'm coming back again to my spinning discussion of Z being clockwise, S being counterclockwise. One thing that showed up in the material, which was really interesting, and this was not actually only noted by me, textiles that are spun Z warp, Z weft. This had been noted by Lisa Bender Jurgensen and Penelope Walton Rogers, that in Viking Scottish burials, most of the textiles were Z to Z spun. So when I started to look around the rest of Europe, this is the sort of thing that was bothering me. I was like, why do you have differences in spin directions in textiles? What is the reason behind this? I'm not the only one to have questioned this, and I'll get to this in a minute. But when I got to Iceland, I found the same thing. I found that in the Viking burials, the majority of the textiles were Z to Z spun, but occasionally you'd have some that were Z to S spun. When I looked at the rest of Europe, and this is what these two researchers had noted as well, that outside of the Norse settlement areas, the textiles being made were Z to S. When I looked across the rest of Europe, they were Z to S as well. Even, in fact, in most of Sweden and Denmark, they were Z to S, when apparently in the past they had been Z to Z. But Norway remained with Z to Z textiles, as did the island of Gotland. So I was wondering, in fact, when I looked at this, I thought, well, is it possible that the reason why we're getting mostly Z to Z with some Z to S is because obviously there's connections with Norway, but there's also huge connections between the British Isles and Iceland. And this might account for the fact that you have Z to S textiles. If they are bringing local women from the British Isles that are potentially bringing different textile traditions with them, this would obviously be reflected in the burial material in Iceland as well. So that's one possibility. The other possibility could be a trade explanation, that in fact they were catering, because they were trading cloth, and they could have been also catering to the European markets as well. But it's an interesting thing. And what happens is, after the end of the Viking Age, they drop all Z to Z textiles, and all textiles are Z to S till they stop weaving on the warp weighted loom, basically. And you can see actually in the data how this is basically, sort of the 12th to 15th century, where it's just basically solidly Z to S, and that's it. So the question about this, I started doing a bit of work about it, and there was an archaeologist in the United States, her name was Minar, and she published in 2001 an article regarding exactly this question. Why is it that some communities spin Z to Z, or Z to S, or S to S, and others communities do something completely the opposite? She was looking at communities in the southwest of the United States, where they have huge textile traditions, actually often woven by men. But she would see that in some communities, side by side, they were spinning in completely opposite directions. And so you'll hear, oh, well, the reason for that is because the material requires it, or they'll tell you stories that textiles come undone if you don't do it this way, or it's because people are right-handed or left-handed. And so she decided to set up a huge project with sort of an experimental project with spinners, modern spinners, and had them spin and try different methods, and finally, came out and said, well, what makes you spin in one direction or the other? And the answer was because this is what they had learned. So these were practices that they had learned from their parents and from their grandparents and so on. And in a sense, she realized that it was really a cultural marker at some level, and you could use this as a cultural marker. And that's kind of the way I looked at it, was basically to think about it in terms of, could this actually be because of the people in Iceland were not homogeneously Norwegian? They were from all over the place, and there were a lot of people coming from the British Isles, a lot of women brought in as slaves or brought in as concubines, and could have in fact introduced a different spinning technique into the mix. So this brings me into another issue, and it's the question of the use of slaves. And obviously there's not a lot of data on this. I didn't find much on this in the, let's say in the saga literature or whatnot. But mostly, like, what were the roles of slaves or thralls, or later even householders in the North Atlantic in textile production? And that made me start to think, well, on one hand, they could have obviously impacted the spin direction of how textiles were made. But I started to also think about it in terms of, well, wait a minute, how long does it actually take to make garments and to make all these textiles and so on, when you had obviously a lot of other things to do? And I was thinking a lot of this in terms of Greenland, where they seem to have, an increasing shortage of sheep actually for wool, and sort of wondering how they would have managed to make the textiles that they needed, in fact, to be able to do this. And so I started to do a combined study, and I'm not putting the whole analysis here. If you want to read all about it, you can go and read it in the book. But basically what I did is I combined some practical studies that had been done, some experimental studies that had been done by Eva Andersen Strand on how long it took to spin like one garment in the Viking Age for one person, and the wool needs that were required. I combined also the work of Tom McGovern had done, looking at the distribution of sheep and the ratios between sheep and cattle in Greenland and then in Iceland as well. And again, wool needs, how much wool would a farm have needed? And he also had an interesting way of organizing this by households. So small households of 4 people, medium household of 10 people, chieftains of 20 people, manor of 40 people. And then also Lisa Bender Jurgensen had some experimental data on how long it would have actually taken to weave the material. So we're talking spinning and then weaving it. And you have the numbers in here. Like I said, I advise you go and read the whole analysis in the book, in the chapter on Greenland. But it gives you kind of a sense, by small farm, how much material you would need. If spun yarn, you would probably need, 84,000 meters of spun yarn. That would have taken you 1,600 hours to do this. And then you had to weave it. And the weaving time would have been about 480 hours. So to do the two would be 2,080 hours, which is about how many days? If you did 8 hours a day, 260 days a year, with possibly one female in the household of 4 doing all that work. So the question is, how did she do anything else if that's what she was doing all day long? And as it goes up in the bigger farms, the quantities increase. And of course, the number of people working, of basically women able to do this. So you could think that this probably would have engaged children in spinning of textiles, slaves, householders for the later period. Basically, a little bit like what I saw as a child in Peru. People are spinning constantly. They're going out in the Andes and they have the drop spindle and they're spinning constantly while they are tending their sheep and while they're doing other things. And children are spinning and everybody's spinning. Probably not men, but at least any female, able-bodied female, would have been spinning continuously to be able to support the needs that they needed. So it's really quite surprising when you see that. Now, the kind of estimates of wool that Tom McGovern had used was based on work by Helgi Thorlaksson, who was looking at the records, I think, of Skuli Magnusson, who was an Icelander, but he was part of the Danish authorities who helped to modernize the wool industry in Iceland. And he reported that you would have needed 30 to 60 kilograms of wool for clothes, 30 kilograms for bedclothes, 10 for sails and sundries, 12 for taxes and tithes, and 70 kilograms for land rent, because of course they were using this as currency. And this was, I think, in the 1500s or 1600s. He was basically describing things from the past that he had recorded. And when you look about this and the amount of work required, this is, first of all, these wool needs are ridiculous because not everybody is going to need a sail. Bedclothes, well, if you think about cloth recycling, they would have recycled all this. And again, I'll show you some examples of that as well. Obviously, you need taxes and tithes. You need to pay your taxes in cloth and land rent. But if women were doing all of this work, and also milking animals, tending animals, cooking, food preparation, childcare, wool cleaning preparation, sewing, what else were they doing? And did they have enough time to do all this? So just when one makes estimations about fleece and wool, you have to really think about the reality on the ground. What are people actually doing? And some of these may have been, I think, slightly exaggerated, which brings me, one of the big ways that they dealt with the issue of wool, both in Iceland and in Greenland, was through cloth recycling. So everything is patched like crazy. So one of the studies I did was another story, is the Burgundian hat, which was a Greenlandic hat, kind of a tall hat, very unusual hat for Greenland. I think there was another one that was found at Herjolfsnes as well, which was a burial ground. And this was quite unusual. It was called Burgundian because Norland, who excavated this in the early 1900s, thought it looked like the hats that they wore in the Burgundian courts, which was actually much later. So with Jette Arneborg at the National Museum of Denmark, she said, why don't we run some AMS dates on this hat? Now, she had run a date earlier on the body of the hat, which was basically from this area here. So what we did is we ran another 2 on this patch here, and then on this one here, and then we did one on the crown of the hat. And to our surprise, the body of the hat dated between roughly 1275 to 1307, which was actually in keeping with her earlier date that she had done. But when we dated the crown of the hat, we came up with something 100 years older, so 1139. So you could ask yourself, well, is this an heirloom? Like, did they keep it because it was a special piece of cloth? I mean, we do this still today. Like, we keep pieces of textile or a shirt because it reminds us of somebody, or we take it apart and then reassemble it into something else. Or, we do hold emotional attachment. So it's very possible that this is what was going on here, or they simply were just using what was available. So I continued and did more studies, and this is one of the Herjolfsnes gowns from Greenland. And you can see they are heavily patched. And I decided to do a similar kind of study and to patch the main body of the dress and then an additional 3 patches. For this one, they were all contemporaneous. So this wasn't sort of showing anything except that cloth recycling was an important thing. And here we have some examples from Iceland. This one here from about 1500 from Bergthorshvot, which is entirely made up of patches. This is part of a legging, which is made up with patches and also even has a patch of knit. So you know that this is basically post 1500 by the simple fact that there is a knitted piece attached to it. This shirt here was from, I think 1791, from the site of Buland, which is in the east, which it was right around the time that there was this huge Laki eruption in Iceland. This one is it was sort of a burial shirt that was worn by a woman, and they had wrapped her lower part of her body just in a piece of patched up cloth. This one I counted 17 patches on it. So you can see that patching, there was nothing sort of, today with our modern sensitivities, we would see this as, oh my God, these people are hobos. It's very possible actually that in the North Atlantic, this was so totally normal and no one thought anything of it, and then it was the way things were done because you had basically no choice in the issue. So moving on, I can't not talk about Vathmal and cloth currency, especially with regards to Iceland. And I just wanted to talk briefly about, how it was used, what it was. According to what I can tell, it starts to be used as currency. In fact, it comes from Norway. So in Norway, in the Gulathing law, there are statements about Vathmal, or about using textiles as in their barter exchange system. In Iceland, it sort of is taken over and it goes crazy. So it becomes really the dominant form of currency in the Middle Ages. You think about it, Iceland's got 2 really great commodities that they can export. One is wool and the other is fish, and that's what they did. Like I said, it has its roots in Norway. So this has jumped on me again. I'm just going to go back one. And the term for this type of currency is vathmal, which integrates 2 Norse words, the word vath for cloth and mal to measure. So what it literally means is that it is cloth measured to a standard, and it should be referred to when talking about this type of currency. It is generally a 2-to-2 twill, it's Z to S spun, and it has a thread count ranging between 4 and 14 warp threads per centimeter. This is in part based on my analysis and the analysis of other people. But what's interesting is that the regulation of this textile or this type of cloth was written down in the law codes, particularly one of the first ones, obviously, being Graugas, which was modeled in part on the Gulathing law as well. So just to show you the difference, if you remember the Scottish material or not the Scottish and the Icelandic Viking Age material, which was sort of all the way up here you suddenly have this very tight cluster, which in fact ranges between about 6 and 15 warp threads per centimeter. And these are multiples. So it's not just one textile we're talking here. These are multiple stacked textiles from various sites. The site of Gásir, a medieval site, a harbor site in northern Iceland. Möðruvellir here is a monastic site very close to Gásir. Bessastaðir is a fairly important political site in eastern Iceland, where the Danish authorities actually had I guess it was one of their bases. Alþingisrætur, which was in Reykjavik itself, which is a harbor site. Kuabot, another monastic site. Meðalheimur, a medium-sized farm in the northwest of Iceland, and Reykholt, which is another important sort of larger farm in Western Iceland as well. And you can see how when I started to get into this is how you can really see the difference, in fact, in textiles from the Viking Age and then suddenly into the medieval period, is that you get this really, really tight standardization. And standardization is part of currency. And this currency was regulated in the law books. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of some of the guidelines that they had. And what happened is that basically hang on a second. What they did is that at first in the early medieval period, and one thing also to bear in mind that we have this idea, or there's been this idea in the North Atlantic, that in Iceland, they basically made textiles until about 1300, and then they stopped, and then they switched, and fish became the main commodity based on zooarchaeological work. Well, that's absolutely false. Textiles continued to be produced industrially right up until the 17th century, until the Danish trade monopoly is imposed. There is no currency. It is a barter economy. There's no coinage at this point. So this is the money. This is basically it. And in the earlier part of the medieval period, basically what they call the basic unit of measure of textiles is equivalent to 1 ounce of silver. What is interesting is as you move through time, they stop talking. So it's obviously very clear that cloth is symbolizing the silver, but eventually they stop talking about the silver as you move on through time, and they just talk about the basic 1 ounce unit of cloth. Now, the basic 1 ounce unit of cloth is 2 L's wide and 6 L's long. Now, an L in Graugas was equivalent to about, basically it's your forearm. So it's supposed to be about 49.2 centimeters. So if you think about the basic unit of measure is basically 1 meter by 3 meters, more or less. And this L changes through time, and it's thought that the reason why they're changing, it goes up to 55.6 centimeters, and it could be, in fact, due to trade, and in fact, to trade also with the United Kingdom, where there was a lot of, there was a shifting going on also in Europe with regards to what the L symbolized. So it's possible that this is a response to that. So you do have different comments about this in the various law codes. In one of the later ones, the Bualog, you actually have some guidelines as to different grades of this vadmal, of this currency, of this cloth currency, or this legal cloth. And you have, for example, a type that was used obviously as currency, which was called geldavos, which was supposed to be 9 to 10 centimeters warp threads per centimeter. One that was called kleidavod, probably for making clothing, which was actually 11 warp threads per centimeter. And then smalvod, which was the highest end stuff, apparently used to pay your taxes to the church, were between 11 to 14 warp threads per centimeter. So you can see that this is really a type of, this is money, basically. So when I like to think about it is that here's an example where women are actually making money. So yes, they are at the basis of the economy. And you could ask yourself, well, when you write the law books, who wrote them down? The men wrote down the law books, but you couldn't have written down these specifications unless you knew exactly how things were made. So you had to be, unless you were making them yourself. And if men were not weaving, it means that women were involved in helping write down these laws as well, and were helping in determining what should be considered legal cloth or not. And these were used, like I said, to pay taxes, to pay tithes, as bride price, as compensation, and it shows up all the time as vadmal. So this is a very, very important commodity. Now, the interesting thing is you do not find this phenomena, it's really very much of an Icelandic phenomena, and you do not find it in the Faroe Islands, and you do not find it in Greenland. Greenland, the production is much more focused towards consumption of households, people making clothing for themselves. So that's kind of also an interesting sort of takeoff. And also another area where you really do see actually the role of women in the economy. They're actually making currency. And I think this has been downplayed somewhat and not really expressed. So another thing also I would like to just finish off with is just to talk about briefly about the Danish trade monopoly, which happens in about 1603. And very quickly at this point onwards, the Danish crown starts to show a big interest in the North Atlantic islands, particularly the resources that the North Atlantic islands has to offer, wool being one of them. And so you find that there is sort of, I would say, in the early 1700s, a very conscientious effort to try and change the way textiles are produced. One, to stop and try and phase out this homespun cloth that they've been making for 800 years, and to look instead towards Denmark as models of textile production. So one of the things that they do is they try to abolish the warp-weighted loom. They install workshops in Reykjavik, and I think also there's a few in regional workshops as well. And they take women out of the equation. And what they do is they take men and they train them in Copenhagen, and they bring them back to run the workshops, now using the new looms, the treadle loom, and the spinning wheel. In fact, they make women spin for the men in the workshop. And the workshops are really quite elaborate. They are able to do all sorts of finishing techniques and dyeing techniques, which were not very common before, or more limited if you want. They even take the textiles that are made in these workshops, send them back to Copenhagen for inspection, and then either sell them back to Iceland or else they sell them around the North Atlantic. They also try to modify the sheep breed to make the sheep's wool more soft. So there's really a sort of a conscious effort to kind of try and control this whole thing. Now, it doesn't work very well. And again, I mentioned Skuli Magnusson before, who opens up his workshops in Reykjavik. 40 years later, the workshop burns down. There's also, like I said before, a lot of trade imported or export or import, I should say, from Europe coming into Iceland. So encouraging people also to start consuming. And this I see as kind of like really the beginning of industrialization in Iceland, the introduction of coin currency, of other things. So my question was, okay, that's all fine. If women have been weaving for 800 years and then all of a sudden they're thrown out of the picture, do they embrace this and say, yay, we don't have to weave anymore, this is great? Or do they say, wait a minute, this is what we do, you know, what's going on here? This was part of the woman's world. This is the part of things that women got together and wove and you know, so how was this actually perceived? And I had the opportunity to work on the site of Skalholt, which is actually the Bishopric of Iceland, thanks to Gavin Lucas, who did excavations on the early modern phase of the site. Particularly, it was the bishop's household, and there was an adjacent school for boys from around Iceland who were coming there to become priests. And the site, the excavations, run from about 1600, 1700, and I think early to mid 1800s. So it's really early modern material. And I went through the textile collection, which was immense, in the thousands. And to see, you know, of course, we found a lot of imported textiles. We found a lot of material, and I'll show you roughly the breakdown of what we had of different things that were potentially imported. But we still ended up with the largest category being the twills, the twills and the plain weaves, which are all homespun cloth. So despite this attempt to try and modernize and impose, you know, a change, the boys who were coming from all over Iceland were coming with clothing that was like the homespun traditional cloth that they had been wearing for hundreds of years. So at some level, I started to wonder myself, is this the resistance that I was looking for? That at some level, you know, the women continued to weave on their warp-weighted looms, and they sent these boys who were all from elite families going to become priests at Skalholt, and they continued to wear their homespun. There was even one of the bishops who was encouraging the use of homespun and to not take on these modern fashions and so on that were being brought into Iceland at the time. So that's all I have to talk to you today about. That's it for me. I wanted to thank you all for participating and for you know, for coming in and listening to this. And I think we can take questions now.
Yeah,
I'll stop the sharing. There we go.
That's it. Thank you, Michèle.
You're very welcome.
That was a very quick sort of run through the book, wasn't it? Just picking up some bits and pieces.
It was. Now you can go and read the book.
Well, I think we definitely need to read. It's just such an eye opener. I really enjoyed, you know, all the detail that you bring by studying the textiles, and also because, you know, sometimes there's been this sort of, you kind of hinted at this sort of debate between textile specialists and archaeologists, and they haven't really understood each other. And some people say, oh, it's just counting threads, and then they don't understand the counting of threads. But right. you can kind of do it all, and you bring it together, and you bring it to life, I think. So I think that's, you know, there are many good things for the book, but that is one major thing, I think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there are some questions here, so I think we can read some of them out, and you can have a go at answering them. So the first one here is, did you detect any crucial differences in your analysis as between loom, woven, nail binding, sprang, embroidered bands, etc., different types of textile production, or were you mainly looking for commonalities across all types of production? Did you manage to follow that question?
Yeah, well, I think that you obviously, when you're going through these massive corpuses, you know, you're coming across different types of weaves, and, you know, I obviously will separate them when I look at them. But, you know, obviously, I'm also, as an archaeologist, I'm looking for patterns in the past. You know, we look for patterns. So we plot our data, and then we say, oh, look at this. There's a lot of 2-to-2 twills in this place. So obviously your attention is drawn to why is that the case, you know? But I've also sort of delved a little bit into the technical aspects of, you know, do I find pile weaving, or am I finding other types of weaves, and how much is there of that compared to other parts of the North Atlantic? Again, looking for the cultural context. Why is there more in one place and less in the other? So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but anyway, I think yes, I do sort of have, you know, pulled out different other types of cloth as well, and also focused on them. I'm actually busy writing a paper about pile weaving at the moment, so it just goes to show that we do we do focus on, you know, specific types of cloth. So
that's interesting, because there are actually another question is if you have a view on why there is such little evidence of pile weave. So maybe you can answer that one.
There's actually the most evidence I found for pile weaving is actually in Norway, which is the weird thing. And actually the North Atlantic doesn't have very much of it. Why? Maybe it was valued. I mean, one of the theories is that it was traded with Norway, but the thing is, we've been doing strontium isotopes on the Norwegian material, and it all looks to be local. So maybe it was, I mean, it is written down in Graugas. It is considered more valuable than Vadmal. So it's possible that it is being used. Now, one thing also to bear in mind that it's not unique to the North Atlantic. It's found all across Europe. It comes from the Mediterranean area. Everybody was doing it. You find it extensively in Ireland as well. So I'm starting to wonder about this trade in Vadmal at the moment. That's kind of my thoughts for now, but we'll see.
Thank you. There was a comment as well, and I was thinking of that myself as you were speaking. You're talking a lot about, you know, the long hours that were needed to produce all the cloth, and of course, you know, reuse is really important.
Right.
But also, how about things that, you know, you can do several things at the time? Perhaps, you know, in Shetland, there's these famous images of women carrying peat and knitting at the same time, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Are there activities like that you could do? You could do more than one thing at a time?
Oh, I think you'd have to. You'd absolutely have to. I mean, like I said, I brought in the example of Peru because you know, I lived in Peru as a kid, and that's one thing we would see in the Andes, women walking around and either knitting or spinning was the big one, and tending sheep and looking after children with a baby strapped to their back. So they're doing lots of different things. You have to. I mean, I think it's the only way to keep going. But I'm sure if you had some slaves, it would have been helpful as well, you know, to get. And the other thing I also remember very clearly is children at the age of 2 years old carrying these huge buckets of water. So you put the kids to work right away. Undoubtedly, they start showing them right away how to spin and how to do textile work, you know, so it becomes, you know, like a second nature, and you just do it constantly. But I think, yeah, we need to incorporate that image into our research and think that this is what they're doing all the time, you know, because otherwise I don't see how you could even dress anybody. Also, they hold on to clothing for a year, 2 years, repatch it, pass it down. When it's no longer any good, then you turn it into household items, pillows, saddle blankets, you know, you are going to use patches. Even the sails I have looked at, I found a couple of sail fragments both in Norway and also some in Iceland, and maybe one in Greenland as well. And they're little tiny squares. So they clearly were, you know, they're little squares like this that seem to have been sewn together. Again, you can reuse stuff and then repurpose it. And we don't think that way in our day and age. We don't think about that important aspect, you know, about how you have to take things apart. So.
Yeah, and even small pieces then, and
even little like, well, we'll use them for the crown of the hat, you know. Right.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess also, you know, children, they would be, you know, learning all the skill as well from a very early age as well. So that's probably, is that part of the training as well?
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure they were engaged in you know, household chores of various sorts very quickly. You see that in a lot of societies. I mean, I was even thinking, I remember seeing something about the Inuit recorded sort of at the turn of the century, or reading accounts by ethnographers about little girls working with their mothers, being taught how to sew skins, how to prepare skins, and the little boys are taken off by the age of 5 and taught how to hunt. So they start off learning the skills of each parent. You know, if you're female, you're learning how all the things your mother, you're following her, you're collecting berries, you're doing everything that they do, you know. And I think you have to think about that when you're talking about these agrarian societies. I mean, this is how it worked, you know.
Yeah, thank you. So there's another question here. This is from Mata Spangen here, very interesting studies. And she says, is there really no qualitative difference between the Z and the S spun yarn and weaving ZZ versus ZS? Doesn't the fabric behave differently within this variation in terms of softness, for instance?
Nope. Not according to my analyses, and I've looked at both kinds. I don't see any difference at all. There's absolutely, they're using the same fibers. I think there's, and the idea that somehow it's going to come undone is false. There's no difference whatsoever. It's just what you've learned. I think it really is. The thing is, if you think about it, you know, you can use this as a useful tool of cultural identity as well. It's like, why are people making things in this way in this community, and next door they're doing something totally different, you know? They're making the same kind of material culture, you know, the same kind of whether that's basketry or, you know, or weaving.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Jonathan. Might weft dominated cloth have been intended for specialized use, such as tents or sailcloth, for instance?
That's possible. The only thing is that, again, based on the analysis, a lot of the gowns, for example, from Herjolfsnes are made with weft dominant cloth. So it's clearly used in clothing as well. I don't think it was necessarily specifically for one purpose or the next, given that so many of the clothing is also weft dominant. And I think Østegard was also, I mean, to my mind, that's jumps out as the biggest collection of weft dominant cloth are the gowns from Herjolfsnes. So it is possible, but I somehow I don't think so.
Thank you. I'm trying to read through all the questions here. That's popped in so many all of a sudden. I think somebody asked if Shetland had come into your research at all.
So I tried to get at, there's not a lot of actually textile remains from Shetland. I mean, there's the material from Papastur, which I believe is back in Shetland. So that was also the problem with Scotland, is that I got to the National Museum in Edinburgh, and they said, well, here's a bunch of the material, but there's also material at the museum in London. There's some material in Glasgow. There's some material here. There's some material in Shetland. So I was like, okay, we're gonna have to do a whole bunch of different trips here to pull this corpus together. That is one actually of Shetland. The material from Papastur, I think, is the one that is most well known, but I haven't looked at it yet. And then COVID hit, so we were stuck, couldn't travel.
Yeah, so maybe another time.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question from Christina. I've been weaving on the warp weighted loom with my hand spinning for 20 years. How do you decide what is warp and what is weft when you're working with fragments? It could be either, depending on how you rotate the piece, especially if you don't have a solid edge there.
Well, actually, obviously the selvage is great use. So if there's any indicators like that, I will use that. But there's also the direction of the textile that you can also. I actually, before I went into archaeology, I was studying in fashion, and we did a lot of work working obviously with textiles and textile design and whatnot. And that's one of the things we learned to do, is also to determine the direction of textiles by looking at them. And you can kind of, you can assess that. The other thing too that you find in the Norse textiles that is also a great indicator of that is that the warps, and this is one thing I didn't mention, is that in the early medieval and Viking Age material, the Icelandic sheep is a dual-coated sheep. So they would remove the outer coat, which was called the tog, from the inner coat, which was called the thel, which is very soft and fluffy. And if you look at this material under a microscope, you'll find that the outer coat, the actual diameter of the yarns, are about 3 times the size as that of the wefts. So also, if you're not sure, just by looking at the diameter of the fibers themselves can help you determine which is warp and which is weft, because they always used the inner coat as the weft. Because it's more fluffy, you can beat it. You can also, it helps to felt and to nap the textile. So that's another thing they do. Now they do that. They do this separation, which is insanely time consuming, but. And there's obviously a logical reason. And if you use the outer coat, which has a very thick diameter, you're suspending this from stones. So obviously these are the tougher yarns, and then you can use the weft to, pack them in. But they do this right up until about 1500s. They stop doing this, and they just leave the wool as such. A little bit, which is what we call lopi today, which is the mix of the two fibers together. It's very itchy. But they start to just leave it alone, and they stop separating roughly around that time as you get closer to the early modern period, which is kind of an interesting, and this could be actually, it could be an influence from Europe maybe, or from trade, or I'm not sure. Or again, it also starts to get really cold in Iceland around 1500 too. So maybe it's a way of keeping the cloth warmer. There's all sorts of little sort of things that decisions people were making to deal with the issues that they were dealing, like the Little Ice Age, where it got really quite cold. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Another question that is from Lux here. Can we be reasonably certain that men didn't participate in spinning if it took so much time?
I think we can be pretty sure about that if you have to go into the mythology for that, though, and you have to look into, there's a lot of associations of men that engaged in spinning and horrible things happened to them, or one of the worst things that could happen was that they had they had too much ergi, or they were somewhat effeminate, or they were accused of homosexuality. This was a big issue, not only with regards to textile work, but other things. And there's a couple of passages that I found that were actually kind of humorous of men complaining who had engaged in, say, they had oar spinning and their bottoms started to itch, for example. So there's definitely attitudes of men not doing and not engaging in this. And like I said, obviously you can't be 100% sure, but given the associations, I'm a firm believer that even though you don't remember what the cultural tradition was, the attitudes remain, and people are like, no, we don't do this kind of thing. I'm sorry. Especially if there's associations, obviously, of being potentially accused of homosexuality because you're engaging in this activity, they're going to say, that's women's work. We don't do that, and leave it at that. So I don't think men were involved in it. But that's my opinion. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think I can say at least 2 more questions, if that's okay, Michèle.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the first one is just Candace just wanted clarification on the source material describing the grisly war textile weaving scene. So if you could just tell us again where it's from, please.
Sorry, I didn't get that. What was from?
I think it's the Valkyries weaving with the heads and the entrails.
That was in Jarl Saga. Is that what was that the question? Where
I
did it come from?
I think that's the one.
Okay.
And hang on, what was it? There was another one. I've lost it now. Oh yes. Do you know where the exported vadmal ended up? Are there lots of finds from the importing countries?
So that's what I'm trying to figure out right now. It's not as easy as you think. So we're using strontium isotopes, and it's definitely quite complicated, especially in Norway, as there seems to be very small, this is what we're finding, small sort of regional variation in strontium isotope ratios. So it's a little complicated, but we did do a study. I actually had a student here at Brown in medieval history who did a fair, well, as best he could with the sources during COVID online. who did a sweep of the data and came out with some incredible material. I mean, there's Vodmal mentioned all over Europe, as far as Austria, Poland, France. So it traveled all over the place. And the fact was, it was cheap. And I think they were using it to clothe the poor. They seem to be using it in military costumes or military uniforms. Religious orders were using this type of cloth. So there is a demand for this cheap Vodmal, which was itchy, I have to say. And when you think of some countries like England, for example, where they're producing fabulous woolens and so on, a lot of their material was actually for export. So to be able to import this cheap stuff from the North Atlantic, was great, because you could actually clothe, your local inhabitants with it. So we're actually preparing a paper on that, and he's got an absolute fabulous map actually that he did of all the locations, which will blow everybody's mind, because it's really quite incredible how much stuff of this was just moving around. Like I said, I think I would need millions and millions of dollars to do a really thorough isotopic study of this trade. So what I've been doing in Norway is sort of already has us a little bit stumped, because it's just like, oh my God, this is really complicated. We need a lot more money to do a lot more studies. So, because you need to have good baselines, and what I'm finding is that to have these big sweeping baselines for Iceland is between this and this, and is actually not helpful, because it turns out that there's so much regional variation that we need to have good baselines to start out with to be able to then track that. So that's where we're at.
Well, thank you. I think that's a fantastic place to stop, actually.
All right.
Thinking of where you might go in the future. And yeah, let's hope that, lots of money finds its way to you.
Yes, fingers crossed.
And do you know where this paper is going to be published? Has that been decided?
The paper on which one? The one on the trade?
The one you just mentioned now, yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is that my student has moved on to the PhD program in medieval history at Cornell. So now I'm sort of like, we need to publish this, So that's one of the things we need to do, but we haven't decided where yet. But I think it really has to come out, because it's really a great paper, and it really shows the extent of this trade, which everybody has completely overlooked and not thought that textiles, again, dismissing textiles when they are important, believe me. It's a form of shelter too, so anyways.
Yeah, well,
so I'll let you all know.
Please do. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. And I can, again, recommend the book Valkyries of Loom. It's University of Florida Press. Yep. And I think it can be bought online. That's right.
You can even get it on Amazon, apparently, I saw. But if you go on the website of the publisher, they sometimes also have special promotions at various times of year. So you might be able to get it cheaper than on Amazon. So.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming along and for all your fantastic questions. There's also lots of comments. Michelle saying thank you for a fantastic seminar. And I think I've seen lots of comments of people having really enjoyed it. So thank you for coming and getting up early today to present.
No worries. I was going to say good morning, but it's actually afternoon for you guys. Well, thank you very much to everybody for attending. And if you want to contact me, I guess I could put my email address in here. I'll just type it in. If anybody has any more questions or wants to follow up on anything, feel free to, hang on, can I say, I can't send it. Nope. You'll have to send it.
Okay, I will try and do that. I will find your email while we've got everybody here.
It's basically Michelle, Michelle_Smith@brown.edu.
Oh yeah, that's right. Let's see if I can get this in. Yeah, I think I got. I put it in the. I'll try and put it in the chat as well. So then it will go in two places, I think. So yes, it's there now. So if people would like to contact Michelle, that's the email address.
Absolutely. All right.
We've got some people who really seem to be really initiated, so you might well get some emails from that one.
Sounds
okay,
good.
but thank you. Thank
All
you
right.
so
Well,
much.
thank you so much,
everybody.
and thank you,
And we'll
Alex,
say
and thank you also to the University of the Highlands and Islands.